Global Partners for Development proudly presents What Do You Understand? A deep dive into the many facets of philanthropy and development. We will have conversations about what really works and what really doesn't. Do we know yet how to solve poverty? Are big ideas the answer, or do we need to look for small, grassroots solutions? Experts in their field will discuss an aspect of their work that they understand particularly well. We will delve into how their work addresses global inequity with an honest conversation about impact. Let's talk about big bets, innovation, social enterprises, large-scale humanitarian aid and the fixation on ending things, or solving humanity's greatest problems, and the issues that arise while tackling it all. I am your host, Rhea Pullen, and my co-host is the Executive Director of Global Partners for Development, Daniel Casanova. And our guest today is Nico Slate. Nico is an author, a historian, and a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He is also the founder and director of the Bajaj Rural Development Lab and socialchange101.org. Hi, Nico. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
All righty. So let's just jump in here. I would love to know just a little bit more about you, a little bit of your background and how you came to be where you are right now as an author, as a historian.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing I'll say is that, like many people, my path has been long and windy, and I will try not to bore you with the long version. I will say that I never expected in my life to be a historian. I didn't take a single history class in college. When it wasn't until I was teaching high school English, trying to figure out what to do with my life, that several people said, hey, you know what? You're really interested in social movements. You're interested in how the world has changed, but you also have this really strong interest in the humanities. You love literature, you love ideas. You know, maybe history might work for you as a way to think about how people change the world and the ideas that they produce in the process. And my goodness, it really turned out to be true for me. When I applied for grad school, I had no idea if I would like it. And now I've been a historian, or an aspiring one, I should say, for over a decade, and I still love it.
That's awesome. And what specific part of history are you drawn to?
I'm drawn to anyone in the past that tried to create sustainable social change. And what gets me really excited is when I see people linking their own efforts to make the world better with others who are fighting perhaps even sometimes very different battles in very different parts of the world. My specific research looks at connections between the American Civil Rights Movement and struggles against racism, imperialism, and caste in India. And the one piece of this that's widely known is the influence of Mahatma Gandhi on Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement more broadly. And what I try to do in my research is look at a larger cast of characters and a larger range of connections between these two massive efforts at social change, the fight against racism in the US and the struggle for freedom in India.
Wow, you're so well-spoken, Nico. You must say that a lot. You must say that a lot. You must have thought about it.
I have thought about these things quite a bit. It doesn't mean I have answers yet. In fact, one of my favorite things about being a historian of social movements is that the people that tended to change the world are the kind of people that are never satisfied with one answer. They're the kind of people, Gandhi was this way, Martin Luther King was this way, and many lesser known heroes of the past were hungry for the questions. They wanted to know, how can we make things better? And they would fight and fight and fight to change things, but never were they satisfied. And that sounds like a bad thing to say, oh no, someone was never satisfied. But no, it's important, because if you think about, for example, something like the civil rights movement in the US or the struggle for India's independence, we can hold these up and celebrate these as achievements, right? Yes, we passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. Yes, the British left India in 1947. But if you actually look at these struggles, they were about so much more than that. And there's no way we can say, for example, that we're living Martin Luther King's dream. We're nowhere near there. We have so much that we still have to do. And similarly in India, the promise of what Gandhi fought for has yet to be achieved. So anyway, to cycle back, I think I do have ready answers for these questions, but it doesn't mean I'm satisfied. I want to keep pushing, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited to speak with you both.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, to really get into the thing, Rhea and I were talking before, like what to ask you, and I think like I'm curious how you see the difference between the current movements now, like BLM, women's rights, even things that are going on in India right now with the caste system, and you know how they differ from those movements. I have strong opinions about it, so I'll say them, but I'm curious to put you on the spot first, so that I can be like, you're wrong. No, I'm kidding.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to hear your opinions, and if I could, I would force you to tell me them first. But I'll boldly dive in and say that, firstly, I do see a lot of similarities. One of the key similarities I see is in the hunger for what you might call intersectional solidarities. By that, I just mean efforts to build bridges between different kinds of movements, right? People fighting against racism, people fighting against sexism, people fighting for the rights of LGBTQ communities, people concerned about climate change. There are a lot of activists out in our world who are thinking broadly and thinking about the way these different injustices intersect and overlap. And that's something that has long been true in social movements. It's one of the things I most admire about many of the figures that I study. A potential difference that I see is that in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and even to some degree in the 50s, there was a huge part of the world that was fighting against European imperialism, right? Much of Asia and Africa had been colonized by Europe. And that effort created opportunities for solidarity that don't exist anymore. And that saddens me sometimes. If you think about, for example, ties between India and the struggle against racism in the US, in the 1930s, you had the most prominent figures in the independence struggle, not just Gandhi, but also Nehru. And then, you know, I could give you a dozen other key figures that are lesser known in the US, who are at the peak of their influence within India's independence movement, and fundamentally see their struggle as bound up with the struggle against racism more broadly across the world. So there's this profound internationalism built into the movement. And that really took a hit as a result of decolonization. So as all these countries become independent, one of the things that happens is that their rulers become, for better or worse, more preoccupied with domestic concerns, and to the degree that they're focused on international issues, often end up doing so from very nation-centered perspectives. And so you don't get the same kinds of solidarities. I mean, I remember when Barack Obama was just elected president, the first foreign leader he hosted at the White House, if I remember correctly, was Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of India. And there was this effort at returning to these old linkages between the freedom struggles in India and freedom struggles in the US, but it's not the same as it once was. And I think there is a hunger among many people across the world to try to rebuild some of those kinds of transnational solidarities. But I think it's harder in our current global context.
Yeah, and it's how about like the effectiveness. Do you think it was more effective? Because back then, you know, where there were the boycotts or the sit-ins, and now I feel like I mostly see marches for all of those things. But do you think anything is actually being done when there aren't hits to businesses or different areas of, you know, transportation? You know, that I feel like I don't see those kind of hits like they did back in the civil rights movement. Do you see that correlation as well?
That's a really great question. I will certainly say that there were certain protests that seemed so incredibly focused on the injustice at hand. And I think the best example are the sit-ins, right, that started in February of 1960. You have, four African-American college freshmen who sit down at Woolworths in North Carolina, and this movement just spreads like wildfire, and you end up with thousands of people, many of them young people from across racial lines, from across different parts of the country, all using their bodies to demonstrate the injustice that they're fighting against. And it's hard to look at that and say, I wish it was as easy to dramatize the injustices that we're facing in our world today. And in many cases it's not. But I think one thing that strikes me is that even at the time, during the sit-in, there were a lot of figures that were concerned that the ease of dramatizing the injustice of a whites only sign in a cafe would actually mislead the movement into focusing too much on those kinds of discrimination and not enough on the deeper forms of inequity that are bound up in things like residential segregation, income inequality, educational inequality, all of these other issues that are still with us today, right? We still have a tremendous wealth gap. We still have profoundly segregated cities. We still have huge disparities in access to education and health. And it's harder to use something like a sit-in to dramatize those. I mean, you can try, but it's just harder.
Right.
But I get some hope. I mean, maybe you could flip this around and see it as an opportunity for despair. But for me, I actually see it as hopeful that I can go back and read someone like Ella Baker, the great African-American civil rights activist and leader, who, you know, in the middle of the sit-in says, wait a minute, friends, we're not just doing this so that we get a seat in that cafe, because just having the right to sit at a cafe and buy a hamburger, that's not going to fundamentally transform society. And that's what we need to do. So the question of efficacy for me, to say it a different way, is bound up with the question of goals. And I think it is true that today many activists are pursuing really difficult goals, really big sweeping goals. And that means it's harder to create protests that will create change immediately. But I do have hope that even something like a march, which yes, to some degree, we're all inured to them because we've seen so many of them, but I still think it can shift the conversation. It can shift the way people think. It can generate more momentum, especially if it's tied in with a variety of different forms of change. I've long been an advocate of combining street protests, which, by the way, I always feel tremendously uncomfortable in. It doesn't fit my own personality very well, even when I study them, right? But I see the advantage of combining street protests with lobbying, with electoral activism, getting people to register to vote, getting people to vote, getting better elected officials, with awareness campaigns, writing op-eds, getting things in the news, with grassroots educational campaigns, right? I mean, all of these things, they work together. And if we're going to really shift the needle in important ways on these difficult issues, we're going to need it all, I think.
Yeah, so to keep going with Ria's question, I'm one ways I want to think that things keep getting better and we live in this the most wonderful times of all human history. And then I also am a little bit like, oh, things were better in the past. Like Bill Russell was the best center ever, But
I don't know, man. Kareem Abdul, aren't you from LA?
I'm from Kareem's great. Kareem might, I see on my perfect team, he might be playing the 4, not the 5.
Okay. Well, I'll give you that maybe.
I'm teasing that. It's all good. And I might pay Bill Russell at the 3. I don't know. No, anyway. But no, I think that I think there's a quality piece. I feel like while thinkers like you, I think, have gotten better and more refined at thinking about how we want to have social change happen in the world, I think that it's also watered down because the people that are participating in it in the mass public are able to do so in such a fleeting way, right? Like there are a lot of, like, by engaging online or like sending emails or participating in social media. And so my fear about those things, or what I feel like happens, is they're really empty. Like if I'm the bad guy, big corporation, whoever that, or the bad part of the government we're trying to change, I'm just like, go ahead, let them like flail around and send emails and click shit. And, at the end of the day, people are just going to forget. And then I can keep moving on with my agenda, and they got to like get their rocks off. And I think that I would say a similar thing I see happening in the Indian government that's really parallel to the US in the same way. It's like there's just this mega force that's moving forward that's really hard to move. So then when I look at those original movements, I think, I don't know, I think maybe the people following Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. were more powerful in the way that they actually were engaging with the physical world and not with ideas. So I'm curious what you think. Am I wrong?
I don't think you're entirely wrong. I would say that there's a great short article by Malcolm Gladwell that came out, I don't know, I want to say maybe 10 years ago. It was in the New Yorker, where he looks at the power of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the most important student-led civil rights organization, and he compares it to contemporary, more tech-driven forms of activism. You know, the use of social media in the Arab Spring, for example.
Yeah.
And his argument is very similar to yours, that the civil rights movement and SNCC activism was driven by people who were consistently willing to risk their lives on the streets and had to build these very strong ties with each other, because otherwise there wasn't anything that they were going to be able to do. Whereas today, there's all these forms of cheap activism, slacktivism, whatever you want to call it, where people can just click, feel like they did something good, and then move on. And if all we're doing is trying to take over Twitter, is that really going to shift the balance of power? I get that line of concern, and I can understand it. I think, though, that it's good to kind of try to piece apart what it is that we really find lacking, because certainly in the past, people were also concerned about controlling ideas, controlling the flow of information. And I'd say today, you know, people involved in Black Lives Matter or any of the other ongoing social movements in this country or in India or anywhere in the world, there's a lot of savvy folks who are willing to take great risks to try to actually change things on the ground. I think that perhaps the biggest difference isn't actually even in those that are actively committed to the movement, and more a question of those who are bystanders to it and how they might be engaged or not engaged. But even there, if you look at the civil rights movement and you look at, right, the vast majority of white people are either hostile to Martin Luther King and the movement, or to the degree that they're supportive, they're incredibly lukewarm. And, you know, perhaps at the most, they might be willing to send in a letter to their congressman or whatnot. But the movement is really driven by a minority within a minority that's willing to fight to create change, and yet change happens. And I do think that in our world today, even though there are dangers to people feeling like all they have to do is click this or click that, my own view is that often that kind of engagement through Twitter or social media or you know, online forms of activism, that it can pull people in, right, and get them engaged and then get them to show up. And we're seeing this in dangerous ways too, right? I mean, we're seeing lots of really terrible, terrifying instances where people get pulled in through online chat groups and then show up on the streets ready to take power. Right. And so I think, you know, we can clearly see that ours is not a world where people are only engaging online. I mean, we're seeing the power of the internet and of social media to move people to take dangerous action. It's not always in the direction that we would want it to be.
Yeah.
But I guess, you know, when I interact with young people, and it's my favorite part of my job, is I get to spend a lot of time with college students and high school students. I meet a lot of people that in just say the last 4 or 5 years are so much more engaged by the world and by the contemporary politics than I certainly was, right? When I was their age in the late 1990s. I think that the rapid pace of change in this country and many parts of the world, and the level of threats from things like climate change, it's so striking that people are tuning in more and getting more involved and finding ways to participate. So there goes my hope again. I'm a hopeful person.
I like
but
that.
I do think there's reasons to believe that we can work together to make this world what it can be.
Yeah, the younger generation really like energizes me. These like 12,
yeah.
13-year-olds who can take over on TikTok and buy up all of, you know, Trump's rally tickets. Like, how in the world? Like, they are energizing to me, and their fight for climate change and all of that, where I think what they're doing, like when I was 13, I was definitely just watching MTV. I don't think I was like out on the streets protesting the climate change. But in that kind of same vein, so like that kind of age range. So the three of us, we all have young kids. I have a 4 and an 8-year-old. How old are your kids, Nico?
Just turned 6 and will be 8.
Okay, and how old are your kids, Daniel?
7, 9 and 11.
Yeah, so this age right now, because of all of the news that's on TV, with all of the marches and, you know, all of the news about George Floyd and all of that, it was very complex because I had the news on a lot, and it was, how do we talk about race and racial injustices? How do we bring that up to kids in a way that doesn't sound so intimidating, so scary? What is a way that you speak to your own kids about race?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I'll say a couple things. First is that I expect most parents listening, this will resonate. It's just that every parent is different, every child is different. I don't think that there's any wisdom that will necessarily apply in every situation. In my case, I've had several opportunities to engage issues of race and racism, whether because of the uniqueness of my family. I had an older brother who passed away, whose father was from Africa. And so race was an important issue in my family growing up, and talking to my kids about their Uncle Peter necessitates talking about race and even racism because of the impact it had on his life. But also just small everyday kinds of things. They're old enough now that they're more attuned and can be made more attuned to the injustices of our world, and also to the beautiful diversity and variety of human existence. So, and I guess this would be my second general point. So my first general point is just it's dangerous to think of these as general points because everyone's unique. And then the second general point is that I do think as an educator in general, you get a lot more when you seize teachable moments. Forgive me for using a cliche, but if you sit kids down, even my kids, I don't know, maybe your kids are better. My kids are both like 6 and 8, but they're already teenagers. I don't know how that happened, but they can tell when I'm trying to get them to learn something, and they're immediately resistant, right? I mean, they're just like, boom, shackles up. They're not going for it. But if it comes out of some kind of an experience, right? And I'll give you one. I mean, I can think of several, but one, we belong to a community center gym / pool that is in a historically African American neighborhood. Most of the folks that work there and use the facility are African American. And when I took the kids to swim there, maybe, I don't know, 6 months, wasn't 6 months, 3 months ago or so, there was a African American woman, very friendly woman, who was at the reception desk, and she had really strikingly blonde hair. And I don't know enough about hair. I don't even know enough about my own hair, so I can't really explain. But the kids, one of them said loudly something like, is that a wig? Something. And they didn't mean it in any way as an insult. They think wigs are really interesting and cool, but they're not savvy enough to know that many people, A, are just sensitive about their hair. B, there's a long, long tradition of clueless white people commenting on, African American folks' hair, and it's a bad idea in general, right? And they don't know that, and they also don't know that there's a whole issue surrounding wigs. So there's all this knowledge they don't have. And the woman, again, she's super, super nice woman, but she also clearly, and she said something, I can't remember exactly what she said, but she said something like, first of all, she's like, no, it's not, and you really shouldn't ask, or something of that sort. And I was embarrassed, of course, as a parent, and especially, as a white parent, I'm embarrassed, and yet I also immediately saw this as, okay, well, here's an opportunity to talk to them about the fact that, there are a lot of differences between how people look in their hair and their skin color, and that it's perfectly natural and normal to notice these things. And there are even ways that we can ask about them respectfully, but we have to recognize that people can be sensitive to these things. And part of the reason, and this is where it becomes a larger conversation, part of the reason is because there's a long history of unfairness. And my kids, I'm sure your kids are this way too, they're big on fairness right now. I mean, my goodness, like If we're doing cookies, they have to have exactly the same kind of cookie. It has to be exactly the same size. They're going to like weigh them. They believe in fairness. And so talking about how it's just not fair that people are still to this day treated differently because of how they look in this country. And so anyway, connecting that to their own experience, I think is really powerful. They're learning about it in school. They're learning about Rosa Parks, and they learn about Martin Luther King, and they're learning a variety of things. And as a historian, overall, I'm happy with what they're learning at school, but I'm also very aware that, it's easy for people to learn the superficial history and not to really bring it home and apply it in their lives. And one way to do that is to look for opportunities where it becomes a lived experience for them.
Right. I know we had an instance because back when school was at home and I could hear everything that was happening, that was being taught, they were talking about Rosa Parks and all of that. And my kids are mixed race. My husband is Chinese American and I am Filipino, and I have darker skin. And my daughter has lighter skin and my son has much darker skin than her. So she turned around and asked me, she says, "Mommy, I have daddy's light skin, but Marshall has your dark skin. Does that mean someone's going to treat him worse?" And I was at that moment, I was like, oh boy. And that's like I just would love to ask you, when we are confronted with these questions where these are just children being inquisitive, and this is her being worried about her little brother. What would you have told her? I honestly don't remember what I said because I was kind of shocked. And because I grew up kind of having issues with my own skin color. I was blown away, and it's like, what would you say to her at that moment?
It sucks to be Marshall.
Oh, that's a really hard question.
I know. What'd you say?
The answer. Well, I think I think I would want simultaneously to be honest, but also be comforting, and that's a really hard thing. I mean, and just think about, again, I'm white. My kids are both white. I grew up with an African-American brother. I had an African-American stepfather. I'm very aware that my own situation as a parent, although there are some challenges to teaching white kids about race, it's dramatically easier than, say, raising a dark-skinned child in a country where that's still a dangerous thing. And I think about my mom raising my brother and having to think about, okay, well, how do I prepare a young Black man to be proud of who he is, to not see it as a bad thing that he is who he is, and yet also to recognize that it could be dangerous for him to be who he is, that he has to be more careful when, for example, a police officer pulls him over, right? He has to think about how he's going to be perceived as a person of color. And I don't have any easy answers for you. That's really hard, because you'd want your child to know, well, people with darker skin can be discriminated against, and they are discriminated against in this country. And that's something that you might have to deal with in your life. But I also want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to make you safe, and we're doing everything we can to make this country a safer and more fair and more equitable place.
I love that, Nico.
Yeah, well, it's, again, I think it must have been really hard for you,
Yeah.
We don't want to keep you forever, because I imagine you have nice things to do, but
well, this has already been a pleasure.
Oh no, I have so much stuff I'd want to keep talking with you about, but for another time, next time I'm in Pittsburgh or whatever. So, but I mean, I think that part of us doing this, I wanted to talk, I think that people, so you spend a lot of time thinking about your projects and the books you're writing, or the things that you're teaching. And so I'm just curious about, what do you feel like you know really well? You joked with me that it was just your kids in the email, but I think I feel like, I feel as a citizen of the world, it's fair for me to ask academics, what do you know really well? Because you're spending a lot of time studying something. So what do you think? Did you think about that?
I did think about it. And I think, look, I mean, I said earlier in our conversation that the people that I study, the people that I see as heroic, are kinds of people that are never satisfied with one answer. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that I know anything well if we define knowing something well as being satisfied, but I would say that I spent a lot of time grappling with what it means to create a better world through nonviolent means. And the kinds of questions we debated earlier: are street marches ineffective in our context? Can people still create linkages across national borders that will actually change real things on the ground? How are we supposed to teach young people to think about race and racism in a way that will equip them to fight for justice, while also hopefully imagining a world where we're beyond the kinds of divisions that we're facing now? These are all things I've grappled with a lot. I still hesitate to say that I know any of these things well, because I don't think these kinds of questions lend themselves to that kind of confidence. But I would say that I'm always eager to talk about them and talk about how we are to use nonviolent means to try to create a better world.
That's great. And then to end, what is something that you're working on right now that you're particularly excited about?
Oh, great question. So one of my current projects is about the Highlander Folk School, which, if you're not familiar with it, anyone listening, Google it. It's one of the most remarkable institutions that is often not taught in the history of civil rights in this country. It's an integrated school that operated in Tennessee. Rosa Parks went there 3 months before she sat down on the bus in Montgomery. Every major civil rights activist went, pretty much every major civil rights activist went through Highlander. And one of the great things about Highlander is that they recorded all of their workshops. So there are these 100 hours or so of incredible audio recordings of civil rights activists talking about their goals, their methods, their struggles. And I spent the last couple of years listening to these tapes and thinking with them about their approach to things. And I'm at the point now where I'm starting to write up what we can learn from these tapes about. And here's my $1 million question that I'll leave you all with: is to what degree does the truth set us free? Or put differently, is being on the side of the truth a guarantee that you'll ultimately win the struggle? Because I'd like to think that the civil rights movement achieved so much in part because the people fighting for it had truth on their side. But I'm enough of a realist to be aware that the truth doesn't always win, at least in the short term. And so one of the things I really want to grapple with this book is the relationship between truth and power. How did the pursuit of truth and knowledge equip and empower people in the civil rights movement? And what can that tell us about our own struggles for truth and justice in the world today?
That's fantastic. I feel like that can go in so many realms right now with all of misinformation and what people believe is the truth, because I feel like there are a lot of people who believe that what they believe is the truth. So,
Oh yeah. Oh, that's very true.
Oh, Nico, thank you so much. This conversation was really helpful to me just as a human and a parent. So thank you. I think it's going to be really helpful to so many other listeners.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Miss you, man. Good.
I miss you too.
It's nice to hear you talk. What a pleasure, really. So
likewise, man. Likewise. Let's have another conversation, and then let's meet up soon. You've been here a couple times. We need to make it to Northern California. It's been too long, man.
Yeah, well, I'll if you make it out here, happy to host you. So
all right, I will take you up on that. I will.
It's good. Well, go hang out with kids or whatever you do.
All right, will do. Take care, friends. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you, Nico.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, we have the advantage of having hindsight to talk about things that we maybe didn't think about while we were interviewing them. So for Nico, what I would have liked to talk to him about is he totally slighted me when I was like, this is what I think about the effectiveness of like things, and he was like, oh no, Daniel, he's like he's like
they're great.
Malcolm Gladwell already wrote that dumb essay with your opinion in it, but he was very polite. And then but what I wanted to talk with him about, but it would be like, I agree, but I think that the right has been more effective at doing it than the left. Like right now, I think we live in a space where the time sensitive thing would be like the truckers in Canada.
I was just gonna say that.
Yeah, right. But I think that meanwhile, where I think my thesis is true is I think the left has gone out and been in streets and done things, but it's lacked the actual literal contact with the real world that the left has gotten really good at, like January 6th or the truckers, or like them right now, like infiltrating all like the volunteer voting counting position. Like they're just way more, and so that's where I think, like, yes, that people are using that old technology, but in my opinion, the right people aren't.
Correct.
Yeah.
But even the ones on the right who are having the January 6th or the truckers, what are they actually achieving though? Because then, Trudeau comes down and uses his power to go against it, or, January 6th, the commission with all of the information coming about who is involved.
Yeah.
Was anything actually changed? Like, Joe Biden is still the president. Like,
True.
The truckers moved and now it's back to open. So yes, the right has been more effective. What you're saying is like touching the real world.
Yeah.
But nothing was done in they didn't get to their endpoint.
Yeah, true. Or no, we don't know. I mean, no, but no, it'll be interesting to see. Like, it would be interesting to see, like, what's going to happen with January 6th. Like, how effective was that? It was close, right? Like, theoretically, people would be like, the pundits, like, oh yeah, we almost had a coup, or like there were those things. But yeah, also what really happened is those people got arrested.
But do you think anything will change when there's such a division between our political parties? I feel like it's just here, and there's not a lot of in the middle actually getting things done.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have my own personal hopes about that stuff. I think on both sides, and really we're just talking about like Democrats and Republicans, I think in both sides there's already a division among them, right? Like there are these really liberal side of the Democrats that are socialist-like, right? And then on the Republican side, they're like, it started with Tea Party people, and now there's all the Trump supporters and all that. Like, there is a divide there. I can see on the Republican side, right, there's going to be this split where, maybe there's a new Republican that's more moderate, and similar on the Democratic side, maybe there's this Democrat thing. I don't know. I mean,
I think that's what you're saying, where the right is actually making changes, because when it comes to social justice and all of that, the right is making laws where they can't teach specific things about Black history.
Yeah.
That is actually
or the transgender stuff that's happening in Texas.
Yeah. Oh, don't say gay or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's like.
But that's real stuff in the world, and that's
happening.
Where they're effective. Yeah. Yeah.
What does the left need to do the reversal, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think we need, people need to be more. They need to be. I think one of the. I'm stumbling. No. We need to stop having dialogue and actually think more about beating them, and because I think that's what the left does. I'm sorry, that's what the right does. That's so effective right now. They don't care about having dialogue with the left.
Right.
They just want to win. The left, on the other hand, when I speak, a lot of my peers, they'll be like, oh, well, we need to have these dialogues. We need to understand why this is happening. And I think really, and I'm not, Nico could say this, I'm sure there's someone else thinking this in a much smarter way than me. We just need to beat them. Like, we don't need to have necessarily those dialogues. Like, great for us if we're good and being like, oh, we can find this middle ground, or we can understand what's happening, good to understand. But at the end, we need to be more practical about how do we actually beat them in the real world? How do we get our people elected? How do we make the changes in laws where we just beat them? Because you know what? They're not making good decisions for our country.
Right, especially when President Trump had 3 justices on the court that completely swayed things, that could turn us back to, women's rights being taken away and how much more.
Look
what can change though.
I know. Look at what a liberal pinko podcast we started.
I'm trying not to be. Do you see how I'm trying not to be? You say we. I say the left and right.
Okay, all right. I think that's good enough.
I think that's good.
Yeah.
Oh wait, no, I have to out it.
Yeah, you got to edit it.
All right. Well, Daniel, this is a good conversation.
Good job.
I think it's something that people do need to talk about. And I know dialogue isn't enough, is what you're saying, but I think it is a conversation that needs to be had, and what can actually be done.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
At Global Partners for Development, our mission is to advance community-led initiatives that improve education and public health in East Africa. We envision a world in which every East African community has the capacity to implement dynamic, sustainable solutions to the challenges they face. To learn more, visit gpfd.org.